As soon as they can, the scammer's going to try and move you away from the communication system run by the dating platform and onto some third-party communication platform. And that's because they're eventually going to get detected one way or another by the dating platform. They're going to have their communication channel shut off, and they're going to lose the target that they've spent maybe days grooming.
Welcome to the Reimagining Cyber podcast, where we share short and to the point perspectives on the cyber landscape. It's all about engaging yet casual conversations on what organizations are doing to reimagine their cyber programs while ensuring their business objectives are top priority. With my co-host, Stan Wisseman, Head of Security Strategist, I'm Rob Borrego, Chief Security Strategist, and this is Reimagining Cyber.
Stan, who do we have joining us for this episode?
Rob, our guest today is Dan Winchester. It's around Valentine's Day, so we thought it would be interesting to take an angle on the dating game by examining scam and fraudsters on dating app sites. And Dan is the co-founder of Scamalytics, and Scamalytics has a focus on helping dating sites remove scammers from their site in real time. And Dan, it's great to have you on us as a guest to help us understand this area a bit more. We haven't covered fraud or scammers at all on the podcast, and so it'd be great to dive into this area. And specifically, you have a focus around dating apps. Is there anything else about your background, though, you'd like to share with our listeners before we get started?
Well, thanks for having me on, Stan and Rob. My background is in online dating, and I've been running a online dating service for 15 years. It was through running that I got into a second business trying to defend dating services against scammers and fraud. So I've sort of seen both sides of the coin in a way. You know, I've run the dating service, and then I've also now, my main focus is in providing a business which helps other dating services, protect themselves against online fraud and scammers.
So let's kind of jump into this a bit. And if you think about it, right, when scammers are going after organizations, right, it ultimately can hurt that organization's reputation and bottom line as well. So I'd imagine, it's especially true for these dating sites and apps. When you look at this, right, and you see that there are users of the apps, if they're using them and then there's, let's say, one too many times where they're kind of getting burned, then it's the scam behind it. It's got to be rather impactful, and they'll move on to something else, I would take it. What's your take on that? What have you seen through your experiences?
Well, generally speaking, very few people actually end up getting scammed. So I think the reputational problem for dating services is not really that their users are getting scammed. It's that their users are encountering fake profiles which are set up by scammers. And most users are kind of savvy enough to realize pretty quickly that they're dealing with a fake profile. I mean, a lot of users will just be able to tell just by looking at it that that's a fake profile, and maybe it's created by a scammer, or maybe it's created by someone who's just up to some mischief. And obviously that's a bad experience for that user. And ultimately, most dating services are trying to move as many of their users as possible over to a subscription. And you're not going to pay a subscription when the product you're subscribing to, which is a database of singles, actually looks like it's just full of junk and scammers. So there's a really good business reason why dating services want to get rid of these scammers as quickly as possible.
No, that makes sense. Let's talk about the data side of the equation. Online merchants are using data for a variety of reasons. For example, they may want to evaluate customer needs to be able to better position their products. They want to, ensure they have regulatory compliance by looking at the data. But collecting this data is just the first step, right? I mean, to effectively put it to use, you also have to be able to organize and control the data in some way. And that can be a struggle for sort of some businesses. And I imagine that's true in the dating sites as well. How have you seen dating sites handle sensitive data that they're collecting?
So this is a really interesting area because there's a tension in dating, as there are in many other sectors. The tension is really between privacy and safety. Users want to feel safe, but they also want to make sure that their privacy is respected. And you have to strike a balance in terms of what you do with user data. So you need to really be figuring out what's the minimum amount of data you can use in order to prevent the maximum amount of fraud. And some data is obviously more impactful than others in detecting fraud, and some data has a higher impact in terms of the user privacy. So to give a really simple example, if you can detect fraud without reading any messages, that's fantastic, because messages are probably the most private piece of information that a user puts on a dating service. And the user may be happy to accept that as a compromise. I want to feel safe, and you're managing to keep me safe without looking at my messages. So those are the kinds of balancing decisions that services have to make.
So Dan, let's kind of double click down on the data aspect a little bit more. So in helping identify the scammers, what are some of the different types of data elements, I guess you would say, that you're collecting from these different dating services and apps? And then what else are you augmenting with additional data elements and sources to really help drive kind of high fidelity of, reality that there is a specific scamming situation or some sort of fraud going on here that help you pinpoint that?
Okay, so it's worth thinking about this in terms of what the scammer is doing, how the scammer's achieving a position where they can execute a scam. And they're almost always doing two things. So the first thing they're doing is they're misrepresenting who they really are. And the second thing they're doing is they're trying to move the target away from the dating service and onto some other platform where they will ultimately execute the scam. And so the data that's useful is often data that can help you confirm whether that user is actually who they say they are. And a simple example might be, if they say they're in one location, but their IP address places them in a different location, that's useful information. And to sort of answer the question about augmenting your data, obviously, once you've got an IP address, there's a whole host of other data sources you can then bring into play in order to, just find out a bit more about that IP address. Is it a regular internet connection? Is it a hosting company? Is it a known proxy? And then, what we do is we try and pull together blacklists of known risky data. So that might be a photo that has been used on many hundreds of fraudulent accounts. It might be an email address that's been used time and time again. So those data points are then effectively made available to lots of different dating services. So fraud on one dating service helps another dating service, which might be a competitor, detect fraud before it becomes a problem.
Dan, just a little bit more on that, curiosity. So do you actually also work with the internet service providers, the hosting providers? You kind of mentioned this, as it relates to some of the reputation of an IP and getting some of that information kind of flowing back and forth with what you're trying to accomplish and what they're able to serve up with information that they know?
We often have quite a tricky relationship with the service providers themselves, because they may not be taking as much action as we would like when fraud happens on their networks. And some of these companies are obviously massive, and it's quite hard to get them to really deal with these kind of issues.
Sure.
So really, we tend to, I would say, we don't really have much contact with those companies themselves. Sometimes companies will come to us and say, we're aware we have a problem and we'd like help, and we can obviously give them information about where the fraud's coming from on their network, which IP addresses, which they can then trace to bad actors within their customer base. So we do some of that, but in the main, we're using third-party data to try and establish as much information we can about the reputation of an IP address or the organization that's controlling it. And then we use that in combination with our own data based on the fraud reports that we're getting across our network of dating services.
So this online fraud area, it can be a complicated crime sector, and it's constantly evolving. Criminals are becoming more sophisticated. I mean, tried and true methods probably always will be attempted, right? But their methods are changing. Merchants need to stay on top of the latest threats and ensure that their strategies to address the most pressing risks are effective. So as the pace and volume of fraud threats continue to increase, and as fraudsters find new ways to attack businesses, what are you seeing as far as some of the next forms of attack that are being applied?
Well, in terms of IP addresses, Scamalytics actually doesn't just look at dating. We help all sorts of sectors, specifically when it comes to IP addresses. So that might be fintech, banking, law enforcement, government, classifieds. And right across the board, one of the biggest challenges we're seeing is this movement of fraud from data center IPs to what's often called residential proxies. A residential proxy will be where a regular internet connection used by just a normal domestic internet user somehow gets carved out into a proxy by a third-party company. And they might do that by providing some sort of software that user wants in exchange for acquiring a small portion of their internet connection.
And probably agreed to it on their licensing agreement too, somehow, to say, yeah, I'll accept that. Don't even realize they're accepting the fact that they're being a proxy, right?
Exactly that. And in the past, IP information has been really useful to detect fraud. And one of the things you can look at is we're expecting a normal internet user, and actually we're seeing a data center, so that's going to up the fraud risk. But if you're seeing just what looks like a normal internet user on an IP address that belongs to a normal residential internet service provider, then it's very hard to put a risk score on that's hard, because you're going to bring normal regular users into that risk score. So I would say that's one of the biggest challenges moving forward. There's things you can do and things that we're having some success with, and I know across the industry it's quite a big challenge. The companies that are offering these IP addresses are really big companies that are presenting themselves as high reputation companies providing a legitimate service. But definitely at our end, we're seeing that those IP addresses are, whatever the legitimate purpose is, we're seeing them being used for fraud.
Dan, let's look a little bit into kind of the future and the evolution of fraud detection. And what role are you seeing today and going forward more, data analytics and specifically machine learning playing and to help be more accurate? Even the examples you were talking about of looking at an IP address, seeing what that person is doing, where they're doing it from, and then all of a sudden that's coming from some different part of the world, as an example. Like, how can we help from a machine learning perspective better isolate those type of issues and kind of offload that to go into more complicated types of scenarios?
I mean, we do a lot of machine learning stuff within Scamalytics, but I would always add a cautionary note that we find that domain knowledge is way, way more useful than machine learning, because when you're dealing with fraud, you've really got to be attuned to false positives. And it's so easy for machine learning systems to get into positive feedback loops and things like that, where actually you're detecting fraud, and then you're starting to label the data that you're learning from, and before you know it, you're potentially flagging relatively low risk data points as high risk data points. So, and there's obviously ways around that, but it's, without getting too technical, it's quite hard to get really good labeled data in terms of fraud, because it's pretty hard to know, where absolutely all the fraud is. So we have big gaps in our data where you've scammers and genuine users, but you've got a massive gray area in the middle where it could be a scammer, but could also be a genuine user, and you can't really label that data. So that's where your domain knowledge comes into play. So I think the machine learning is really good for the kind of simpler problems where you just need tons and tons of scale and you need to make some quick decisions. But I would definitely caution against these kind of black box models where you're getting an output and you're kind of not really sure how that decision is being made under the bonnet, and then using that in production.
So Dan, I know you don't deal directly with the consumers of these dating apps, but in general, do you have advice of what a consumer of a dating app should be looking for? You mentioned, again, experienced users probably recognize, illegitimate profiles quickly, but are there some tips of the trade, as it were, that you can share?
A piece of advice that I always give out, and I think this would keep the vast majority of people safe, is stay on the messaging system of the dating service. And the reason for that is twofold. First of all, as soon as they can, the scammer's going to try and move you away from the communication system run by the dating platform and onto some third-party communication platform. And that's because they're eventually going to get detected one way or another by the dating platform. They're going to have their communication channel shut off, and they're going to lose the target that they've spent maybe days grooming. So they need to secure that communication channel. And the easiest way to do that is move to a different one. And the other problem for the scammer is the dating service has got all these security systems in place to try and make sure that fraud isn't going to happen to its users. Whereas a communication platform that's purely about communication, maybe it's even focused on privacy, just isn't going to have those sorts of systems in place. So the scammer is in a much stronger position in terms of then executing the scam. We hardly ever see scams executed on our client services. It's almost always executed away from the client service. So dating services provide messaging systems, and most of those messaging systems are pretty good. So my advice would be to just stay on those messaging systems, don't leave them, and really get to know someone before you agree to move the conversation elsewhere.
Makes sense.
Well, Dan, thanks for coming on and sharing a lot of the insights within a specific area we've not come across and discussed in the past. So kind of looking at it from the scamming elements of what actually takes place in some of the different dating service apps that are out there. But even more importantly for the audience to hear some of the specific these are the things you should really take into account as part of, as you mentioned, stay within the app, stay within the messaging platform that they have. Don't go elsewhere, because that's the first sign of there's probably some sort of fraud activity happening behind the scenes. So thanks for coming on and sharing that with us. We really appreciate it.
Thanks, guys.
Thanks, Dan.
Thanks for listening to the Reimagining Cyber podcast. We hope you enjoyed this episode. If you would like to have us cover a specific topic of interest, feel free to reach out to us, and you can find out how in the show notes. And don't forget to subscribe.